Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you're listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we're talking with Susan Rich, a Seattle poet. She's the author of 4 collections of poetry, including Cloud Pharmacy, The Alchemist's Kitchen, named a finalist for the Forward Prize and the Washington State Book Award, Cures Include Travel, and The Cartographer's Tongue, winner of the PEN USA Award for Poetry and the Peace Corps Writers Award. Along with Brian Turner and Jared Hockley, she is editor of The Strangest of Theaters, Poets Writing Across Borders. She has received awards and fellowships from Artists Trust, City Artists, For Culture, the Times Literary Supplement of London, Peace Corps Writers, and the Fulbright Foundation. Rich's poems have appeared in the Harvard Review, New England Review, and the Southern Review, among many others. She has worked as a staff person for Amnesty International, an electoral supervisor in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and a human rights trainer in Gaza and the West Bank. Rich lived in the Republic of Niger, West Africa, as a Peace Corps volunteer, later moving to South Africa to teach at the University of Cape Town on a Fulbright Fellowship. Rich's international awards include the Times Literary Supplement Award, a residency at the Tyrone Guthrie Center in Ireland, and a residency at a foundation in Spain. I will ask Susan later how to say that. Other poetry honors include an Artists Trust Fellowship, a For Culture Award, a City Artists Project Award, a GAP Award, and participation in the Galway Literary Festival in Ireland. Susan, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
It's nice to be talking with you. Maybe we should start with you correcting my pronunciation. What was it that I stumbled over that was a residency in Spain?
I think you mean Fundación Valparaíso, which was a residency that I write about in Cloud Pharmacy because it was set fire. It burned while I was there. So,
oh, my goodness.
Makes sense that you would stumble on something that was really a stumbling block in my life as well.
Yes. Well, should we start by hearing a little bit more about that event?
Sure. So Fundación Valparaíso is one of the few residencies, in fact, the only residency I know of, that when you're accepted to it, gives you a free month in Spain. And in fact, I think it's the only one I know of in Europe where if they accept you, you just have to get yourself there, and then you get fed, you get to stay right by the ocean. It's quite lovely in many respects. I had been offered it many, many years ago when I was in South Africa and couldn't do it. Flash forward literally about 15 years, and I'm going through old papers, and I see this letter of acceptance, and I go onto the Internet, and I find that they're still there, and they're still honoring this letter from many years ago. So I go to Spain, and one side note is that I went the summer I turned 50. And I had this belief that if I turned 50 outside of the country, it wouldn't really count. The years wouldn't catch up with me. And so I thought I was very smart and very clever to do this. The problem was that I was there for the hottest summer on record in all of Europe. And we heard a lot about the fires in Greece. We heard about fires in Barcelona. But I was in a tiny little village called Oaxaca. And it was the kind of southern Andalusia is the area that I was in, and when the fires came, there were literally no fire trucks. There was no way for 8 hours for anybody to get there and help us. So we were evacuated. The entire town and towns next to us were evacuated. And this was in the 3rd week of a writing residency. A former student had come to visit me, and, chaos ensued.
Right. What did you do for the last week of that residency?
It took almost a week for me to figure out how to get back to the States, so they couldn't help us anymore in terms of the place was not habitable. It didn't burn to the ground, and some of the poems talk about this because there was one worker who stayed behind, and he just kept pouring water in rings around the building, and so it was smoke-laden, and it was not inhabitable, but it hadn't burned to the ground. So I spent some time actually in Madrid and just really trying to get a ticket to get out of Europe in the middle of summer, which of course is high season, and to get back home. All I wanted to do was to be in my own house.
The poems that you wrote from that incident, do they address something in your life in addition to the fire, or are they mostly focused on that moment?
No, they go beyond that moment, and fire becomes somewhat of a metaphor for many things, for passion and for destruction. It's also the sense of I was trying to avoid turning 50, and instead it turned into this incredible kind of explosion, like nothing I had ever been in before. So the poems are kind of far-reaching. Some of them are about the fire, about the man, Sebastian, who saved the house. There's some writing to fire directly because mad at it for taking over it. It took on what felt like a whole persona, very, very beautiful in parts, and no one ever talks about fire that way. And of course, people lost their farms and their land, etc. So, yeah, fire becomes larger than just that one incident.
It is in your newest book, Cloud Pharmacy, that these poems exist. So it's an interesting thought to me that the poems about fire are in a book with a title that has the word cloud in it. Is there any correlation?
I think there's a lot of kind of elements in here. So there's kind of air, there's fire, there's lots of water because I live not far from the Puget Sound, and I am trying to get those elements in.
I see. Are you prepared to read from that book?
I would be happy to read from this book.
Thank you.
I can start with a poem about the fire, the one I was actually just referencing, and kind of it gives a good sense of how I'm trying to do a few things with it. The poem is called Darling, This Relationship is Damned. Dear fire, how you flirt and flicker, you scat along this Spanish seaside town. Hot lover, tango dancer who insists on playing around. Yes, I fear you, home wrecker, double crosser, fickle fool made of gases and tongues. Of course, you persist with your side of the story. Chemistry, cigarettes, the late-night pleasures of coffee with jam. Am I wrong to even write? Wildfires hugging the roundabouts, the hillsides. Count them, 8 hours before the little trucks arrived. It's not my fault you'd pout, and yes, you could be right. Certain unforgivable elements conspire. Intense heat and dust and men, natural for a flame to grab what it wants, whether lemon grove or nightclub or skin.
Thank you, Susan. Did you have to take some time after the fire and after the difficulty in getting home before things could settle down so you could write?
Yeah, it's interesting that some of the poems happened very quickly after, and there really was. I was in a state when I came back, I couldn't get the scent off of my skin, off of my clothes. I was washing and rewashing things from the suitcase until it finally dawned on me that I don't think it was the fabric where the scent still resided, that it was inside of my head. And I wrote some of the poems in the first few weeks back. It was sort of any time I started to write, it was the only thing that I could write about. And then some of these poems, in fact, the one I just read, I think is probably the last poem in the sequence. And that was written at least a year or so later when I was able to kind of be in a calmer state and not be on alert all the time. So the poems range from a few weeks, literally probably just a week or so after, to about a year after.
Wow. Would you like to share another poem from that book?
Sure. I think I'll leave the fire behind if you don't mind. I'll read the title poem, which is called Cloud Pharmacy. How many apothecary draws could I fill with these deliberations? The pharmacist's paper cone parsing out a quarter cup of love's resistant drug. Spoons measuring new prescriptions for my uncertainty, heart sway, gesture. Give me cobalt bottles left over from Aunt Iska's cures, albastrons of ointments, resins to resolve the double helix of desire inside of me. Where is the votive, the vessel, the slide rule calculation of how much good love, alchemically speaking, is good enough? I want spindrift nights on swimmers' thighs. I want an Egyptian elevator inlaid in camphorwood and ivory, a West African drumbeat, an eggnog, a god. I want waves and summer all year long. I want you, and I want more.
Thank you. Travel has definitely influenced your poetry writing. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that. It's an interesting aspect to your career. I think that you've spent so much time abroad and even in war zones at times. Can you say anything about the connection between that and your poems?
Oh, sure. I think in some of my earlier work, it's very direct that I'm writing poems about people that I met. And I'll kind of start with, I did Peace Corps for 2 years in the mid-'80s and went to West Africa and lived on the edge of the Sahara Desert in the Sahel region. And when I came home, I couldn't write about it. I just felt so much that I had more questions than I had answers. To spend 2 years in a culture that has many different languages, none of that you're fluent in, all of that you're kind of trying to learn, left me with many more questions than answers. And so for 7 years, I really didn't write anything about that experience until I realized, well, even my imperfect knowledge was more than most Americans had about a country called Niger in West Africa. So I began to write about people I knew and direct experiences I'd had, and really almost like a type of poetic documentation. So I did that for quite a long time because I felt like if I experienced it with my own eyes, I'm not making generalities about people. I'm not pretending to be an expert. But things have shifted since that time. That was 2000 when I first started writing, or when the first book came out. And now, as in the poem Cloud Pharmacy, there's more kind of hints of things. There's the Egyptian elevator. There's the West African drumbeat. There are fragmented images from my past that have become almost dreamlike, things that I kind of pull out of my memory from a long time ago, like perhaps all of us do as we get older. And so they kind of don't come in these little neat photographs anymore. They come more as fragments of my imagination, I guess.
So, Susan, were you already a poet when you began writing about your Peace Corps experience or the country that it was in?
Yes. It's an interesting question because saying one is a poet always feels to me a little bit like saying, are you a prophet? Are you a philosopher? So it's hard for me to claim, but I'll claim it nonetheless and say that I studied poetry in college as a college undergraduate. That was my major, was poetry. But I had a terrible experience, and I had teachers who really said, who took me aside, made a point of saying, you might want to try something else, young woman.
Oh, dear.
Maybe you should. So I didn't write for a long time. So the answer to your question is a little complicated. I had given up on writing after being an undergraduate. Peace Corps was about 3 years later. And in a sense, writing about those experiences in Peace Corps is what brought me back to poetry after really about 12 years away from it.
To say you're a poet is something, in a way, only you can actually say with, like you said, you're going to own it. Nobody can know what your writing can become, not even you as the writer. It's clear to me that when you said you began writing about that experience in a genre that would help you not know the answers because you didn't have the answers, it seems that that's perfect for poetry, that poetry is a vessel for exploring, not for starting out knowing something. Would you agree?
Well, I feel like I know very little, so maybe in that way I really do fit the poet.
I think you do, but in many, many ways, your poetry is quite beautiful. And you've had a lot of success publishing collections, 4 collections in how many years? 15?
About 15.
Yeah,
15 years.
It's quite phenomenal because each poem, it's not like you write them in a flash. They take time. The other thing I know that you've been doing all this time that you've been publishing your books is something that's very community-minded, sometimes politically and sometimes within the writing and poetry community or the teaching community. I know that some of your projects now include a blog about writing, include a group of women who are coming together, teaming up, called Book Lift, to help each other with the promotion aspect, which is especially hard in poetry. You teach and develop other students, and I'm sure you are doing even more, editing those anthologies, the one that we mentioned about writing in other countries across borders, is a real time-consuming effort, and I think it's very laudable that as a poet you're doing this other work, and I wonder if you might want to talk about any of it or how you come to it.
I guess I see it in some ways all of one piece, and you're right in the sense that I was an activist before, in some ways, I got very involved with poetry. I was working against apartheid in South Africa and working in international issues, and understood from that experience, especially from working at Amnesty International for 5 years, that things don't happen unless people get together and push. Nobody was going to ask me to necessarily edit an anthology unless I'd already had lots of conversations saying, we need a book like this. We need something that lets people know that they can go to different countries to write, that they can go beyond their own borders. That book came about, I'll just use that as an example to start. Ilya Kaminsky, the poet who I had met when he came to Seattle many years ago, and I had become friends, and we would often talk about how many times students thought if they wanted to be writers, they should go do an MFA, and they didn't see that there were lots of other ways to become a writer. As a poet, you could travel, you could go to festivals, you could become a Peace Corps volunteer, that all these things could feed your work. So we would talk about this and say, somebody should write a book about that. Flash forward about 5 years, and I have an email from Ilya saying, remember that book we talked about doing? How would you like to be one of the editors of it? Because he had also been thinking about that and was then in a position with the Poetry Foundation to kind of start up new projects. So I say that just because it emerged out of a conversation. I can remember being at Elliott Bay Books in Seattle in the poetry section when we had a conversation about that. And every organization that I've kind of started or helped start comes from that need of something that's not really there. You mentioned Brooklift, which is a great example of that. We probably have about 24 women now in different parts of the U.S., mostly based in the western Washington area. And it came about because with my third book, Alchemist's Kitchen, I knew what I was up against when I started having to do some publicity for it. And I just thought, I really need some help with this. And I just need someone to give me a kick in the pants to get started and to give me some fresh ideas. So I emailed just a few writer friends in different genres, poetry, prose, photography, all sorts of things, saying, does anybody see this as a need? Would anyone like to maybe get together or start some kind of email exchange to help each other in whatever ways we can? And the response was tremendous. Everybody wrote back and said, yes, I do want this. Please, let's get started. And again, that was about 5 years ago. And it's just groupings that come about because nobody else has quite figured out how to fill that need yet, rather than my thinking, it's time to start an organization. And I also really believe that no matter what one does, whether it's writing poetry or being a top-notch chef or being an athlete, you need to surround yourself by people who have a similar life view so that you don't feel quite so strange and so that you can kind of talk to people of your own tribe. And so I think for me, it's very natural to say, let's get together and do this. Do you want to try this? Without there being years of commitment, just give it a try.
That's a very beautiful explanation, Susan. So it seems like being open to experience and just seeing and being with the need is crucial to having things happen, especially in the world of poetry. Teaming up with other people, sharing ideas, being remembered for those ideas, and then tapped and then coming through with your own energy behind them. So I personally want to thank you for the energy you put behind the way you share with the larger community. I want to switch subjects now and ask you about the publishers of your books. Are they all from the same publisher?
Publisher for my collections of poetry, Alchemist's Kitchen and Cures Include Travel Cloud Pharmacy and Cartographer's Tongue, are all White Pine Press. And the publisher for Strangest of Theaters, the anthology that you mentioned, was McSweeney's and Poetry Foundation jointly publishing that.
Fabulous. So how does a poet get lucky enough to have a publisher put out their work over and over again and follow their career?
Dumb luck. I really think that has a lot to do with it. And it has to do with community, because I first wrote to Dennis Maloney when I was trying to get poems by a South African poet who I became friends with and who I admired her work very much, a top poet in South Africa, Ingrid de Kock. And she had not at that point been published in the United States. And I just thought somebody should really publish this amazing woman poet who I adored. So I wrote him on behalf of Ingrid and kind of said who she was and sent some poems. And at that same time, a South African publisher who I had met had decided that he wanted to try to find an American to joint publish my work. So Dennis at the same time got a letter from me saying, you really should publish Ingrid de Kock from South Africa. And then he got this other letter saying, I'm publishing Susan Rich in South Africa, and would you like to be my partner with that? So those things are happening simultaneously. There's many conversations back and forth. Comes to happen that Cartographer's Tongue comes out, and about 5 years later I get to meet Dennis because I live in Seattle and he lives in Buffalo, New York. And I asked him sort of what made him decide to take my work, because he's a man of very few words. He'd never really talked about my work with me, and I didn't understand what had possessed him. I was young and didn't have much of a background of publishing. And he said, you're the only poet who's ever approached me on behalf of another poet. And that made me take notice. And I tell that story to young writers because I think it so shows that when you're going and helping other people, you never know how that's going to inadvertently help your own work as well.
That's beautiful, and that's what we do with poetry. I mean, we hope that our poems will go out in the world and be of some solace to people. Thank you for telling a history of that. And then, obviously, White Pine enjoyed your work enough to consider each of your following manuscripts. I admire that and want to know if there's another one in the works.
It's hard to know what's going to happen next. I'm sure you know from your own experience being a poet that when a book comes out, a lot of attention goes towards the book itself so you can launch it into the world successfully, we hope. Having said that, I am definitely writing new poems, but I don't know that I can say exactly what the project is yet, except that one thing I see being stronger in Cloud Pharmacy and certainly continuing is this real interest in the surreal and in kind of focusing on the visual arts and seeing if there's ways to collaborate with artists either living or dead. So that's probably more than I even knew I knew.
Well, good. It does seem to me that your interest in visual art and fine art is reflected in a lot of your poems from earlier books. Do you want to address anything about that aspect of your writing?
Sure. In The Alchemist's Kitchen and in Cloud Pharmacy, there's a section, in Cloud Pharmacy it's a discrete section, of poems about women photographers from the Victorian era, really from the 1880s, 1890s primarily, who I just happened to discover in different ways. I'll give you an example. Hannah Maynard, who was a Canadian photographer, there's one book about her called The Magic Box, and I found it when I was in Port Townsend. Her photographs were so strange to me. In the 1880s, 1890s, when people were first really able to afford cameras, they were experimenting a lot. So she did these portraits that are multiple exposure self-portraits. I always say she was the mother of the selfie because she did so many of these very strange pieces where she might have herself floating in the air and pouring tea on another image of her head, all sorts of odd things that I didn't understand. I don't know that I understand now, but the more I learned about her, the more I learned that she did these pieces when she was grieving the loss of her child. She had a daughter who died as a teenager, and the years kind of coincide with right after that. So I got very interested in the work. I wasn't sure how to enter it because it was already so strange, but I think it just kind of woke me up to this idea that although surrealism I think of often in the realm of a more male world, that there's nothing that says that as a woman artist one can't use surrealism as well.
Wow. So, and you're following that along with your new poems.
I think as writers we need to find a way to keep ourselves still being interested in what we have to say. And so this seems at the moment to be my kind of new thing.
Thank you. So tell me a little bit about your blog. Speaking of things that you do to keep yourself interested, are you finding blogging serves that purpose?
Yeah, I started the blog for a couple of different reasons. Because I teach full-time and, as we all do, have a busy life, I found that I'd come to the page to write, and it would sort of be too intimidating. It sounds a little bit strange to be intimidated by a white piece of paper, but I was. I felt kind of blocked. And I had friends that were bloggers, and I thought, blogs aren't particularly great literature. I don't have to worry about it in the same way I worry perhaps to get a poem started. And so I thought, I've had an experience in my life as a journalist. This will be my way of just being fresh. I can come home from a day of school. I might not have the energy to write a poem, but I can write a blog post. And so it started as a way for me to see if I could produce something quicker than a poem can be produced in my life. And I also felt like it was a wonderful way to help other people and to kind of keep a record of what I was thinking about in terms of writing. So I think it's about poetry and the creative writing life, which I think leaves me open to try lots of things. I did something recently that people seem to like about ways to prepare for a reading. If you're new to doing a poetry reading, what are some things that might help get you started? What are some things that are important to think about beforehand so the day goes well? And so I like doing that. I like doing lists of helpful things. If I read a book that I really love, I like doing short book reviews and promoting them.
So it's an extension of your writing life, again, sharing it with community. I want to ask you how people can find your blog online.
They can find my blog online by going to thealchemistkitchen.blogspot.com.
Right.
And I think even if they just put in The Alchemist Kitchen Susan Rich, it'll pop up pretty quickly.
Oh, good. And even if they just put in Susan Rich, I bet they will find it too eventually. Thank you. You don't find writing the blog draining? It sounds to me like you find it sort of a culmination of a day's work in some way.
Yeah, I try to. It is fun because really there's no other reason to do it. And it is also true that when I started, I think the first year, I tried to write every single day. I was just completely like, oh my goodness, I have an obligation. And then I realized I'm going to burn out awfully quickly if I say I have to do this 7 days a week. And over the years, I think I've had the blog 4 years now, I'm sort of into the twice a week putting new postings, and that feels like something I can sustain because I would like to be able to sustain that. One of the fun things that came out of that was when I went on my book tour that I set up for Alchemist Kitchen. I went to San Diego and to Miami and to Boston, and in each place that I read, at least one person came up to me and said, I saw from your blog that you were going to be in town. I wanted to come say hello, and I was so excited. Literally, it was really just one person in each place, but it made me realize that there's such a thing as a poetry community beyond the people that I know, and I love the idea. I always look on the blog to see people in Turkey are reading it, or people in Bosnia once in a while, or many Russians. And so the idea that people find something useful there, it's always hard to say what, but that it's getting seen in different parts of the world, I find really exciting.
It's very rewarding. It's wonderful. Is it interfering with your poetry writing, or are you finding those days where you do have the energy to invest in the poems?
My poetry writing, I'll be honest, happens more on my winter break, my spring break, and through summer. I sometimes can do kind of a poem a month is about as much as I can handle when I'm teaching full-time or on sabbaticals. And so I think it's a way for me to really claim that I'm still in the writing life. Even if I don't have the energy at the end of the day to come home and compose a poem, I do have the energy to read or to share advice with other writers. So I think that for me, if my writing life was only about my relationship with the poem on the page, I might get discouraged far more often. And so it's helpful to me to be able to broaden what it means to be a poet in the world.
Susan, thank you so much. I can feel your energy coming right through the telephone lines, and I so appreciate all that you said and all that you share with poets. So I hope people will go look you up online, Susan Rich, and you'll find her blog at thealchemistkitchenblogspot.com. I have that right?
You do.
All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this time talking.
I've enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman. Production coordinator is Mike Schlexer.